Good morning, Professor Kratz. How are you?
I am muted, but I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I've been told that it's important that you have your name on your Zoom account that shows up. That's how they take attendance. I'm going to put it in the chat right now, how to get your CEUs and look at recorded sessions from previous times, yesterday and this morning. So there's that, and we'll do it again. I'm sure that many of you will have questions. We will allow the last 10 minutes for questions. So about 12:35, we'll break off for questions, and then at 12:45 we'll finish up. But first, I want to introduce John Kratz, LCSW. He is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma at Tulsa, and online, I believe. That's correct, right? Mm-hmm. He has an extensive background in juvenile justice and forensic social work, as well as in mental health and school-based services with children and families. He teaches across the direct practice curriculum, including courses in mental health, group work, advanced clinical social work theories of practice, and the integrative seminar. The research that he does at OU focuses on clinical pedagogy related to motivational interviewing and high fidelity clinical simulation and suicidality. So without further ado, Mr. Kratz.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, well, good to see everybody. I am just now kind of processing that I only have 30 minutes with you. I think I was planning for closer to an hour, so I'm going to have some pressured speech to get through everything I wanted to share with you today. So I apologize for that. Also, I apologize for a little bit of a bait and switch. The title of my talk did not get communicated to the committee, which is not preparing for the exams, but the trouble with the ASWB exams. And I will also touch on preparation towards the end of the talk. Here's my agenda for our time together. I want to talk a little bit about the process and systems around licensure. And I was noticing on the roster on Zoom that there's quite a few of you who are from our online program. So just a word of warning, most of what I'm going to share about process and systems is directly for the state of Oklahoma. And so it will probably be similar in other communities, but there may be some differences. So just take that for what it is. I want to spend some time talking about the elephant in the room, which is the recently released data from ASWB that revealed some serious concerns about the exam's impact on BIPOC MSW students. We'll go through the history of how we got here, which I call 107 years of shadow boxing. And then we'll talk about some concerns about ASWB and transparency, pathways for advocacy, and then finally, for all of the students on the call, some ideas for preparing for this exam, since many of you will still be taking these exams for the foreseeable future. So let's get started looking at some of the different structures around social work as a profession. And so the different gatekeeping processes, exams and licensure processes that we look at as social workers. The first one is overseen by an organization called CSWE, the Council on Social Work Education, which governs and accredits schools of social work. And schools of social work have for a very long time been seen as the proper formal training for social workers, primarily through the issuing of bachelor's and master's degrees in social work. I'm going to talk primarily about master's degrees here. And how we then have these new systems that enter your life as a graduate, where you then now are somebody who has graduated from an accredited institution with a master's degree in social work, and now you're going to the state of Oklahoma, if this is the state you live in, to get a license. Most of us will start off these days with an LMSW provisional license. The minute you have a MSW from an accredited institution, you're eligible to get this provisional license, and that starts the process of getting introduced to another organization called the ASWB, the Association of Social Work Boards. And their function is to create licensing exams that then state boards like the state of Oklahoma's board will use to basically license clinicians. And so you have a year to pass that to get your LMSW, the full license. That allows you to get your supervision underway for a clinical license or an administrative license. And so that's a 2-year process, about 4,000 hours. Once that's done, you get another provisional license, which opens the door for yet another exam from the ASWB, which is the clinical exam. And so this is the general structure and pathway into our profession. This is what the gatekeeping looks like for social work in most states, and in fact, a lot of Canada, is this sort of higher education, sort of beginning education and training, and then states and licensing bodies working together with the ASWB to provide licenses. There's another important organization that doesn't really directly fit into this process that I do want to highlight, which is the NASW, which is our professional organization of social workers. And they kind of represent our profession and advocate for our profession, sometimes in relationship to these other structures and organizations. Now, I say all this to kind of bring us to the point of what's the problem with this? Why are people concerned? Why is there so much conversation about this process lately? And it all comes to this elephant in the room, which is basically where we now know that ASWB exams are racist, ageist, and we have serious concerns about them being ableist. And we have basically data to look at. This isn't an abstraction. This isn't anecdotal. This is 10 years worth of data that we can look at that indicates these concerns. And so in the state of Oklahoma, for example, between 2011 and 2021, this is the first time pass rate on the LMSW exam. And so you can already see the delta between white students at 84.8% and BIPOC students in first-time pass rates. Also, I've highlighted here the sort of delta between younger students, 18 to 29, and I could also include 30 to 39 in that sort of bucket, and then older students, and how there's a difference in general in pass rates. Similarly, we could look at LCSW data that was released. This should really bother all of us. That 36% in particular for Black LMSWs passing their first attempt on the LCSW exam compared to 76% is something that really jumps out at us and gives us a real concern about the fairness and equity in these exams. And so this is data that isn't just in Oklahoma. We can look at other states, and we have, you look at the state of Texas, where we have a substantially larger sample size. And you see a similar delta of about a 40% gap in pass rate for BIPOC students compared to white students, similar gap along those other domains. You can look at Alabama. I chose this state because this is one of the states where the number of test takers who are Black and white is nearly equivalent. So you have a much larger sample or equitable sample size, but we still see a huge delta here between those students in terms of pass rates. And then we can look at Louisiana. I chose this state because it's a state where more Black students take the test than white students. And so we have an even more representative sample here, and you can see that it's even more acutely felt in this community. Nationally, the average is pretty consistent from state to state, though. We see about a 40% difference between, in particular, Black students, but also a significant disparity for Native American and Indigenous students and Latinx students between their pass rates and white students. And so this is kind of why this data was just released last year. This is why there's been so much language and, sort of op-eds and conversation. I mean, literally the New York Times has had op-eds about this. It's been all over the country, people having conversations about social work licensure and sort of the concerns with it and what we can do moving forward. I want to take you on a little bit of a sort of a history of the social work profession in about 5 minutes to kind of talk about how we got here. In many ways, a lot of the systems in social work are a response to the forming of the profession 100 years ago. in which we were trying to take this work that was being done primarily by white women in urban areas around the country and make sense of what does it mean to be a social worker. And there was an inflection point at a national conference of social workers in 1915, where an education researcher named Abraham Flexner had a very compelling speech about the social work profession. Interestingly, the way he defined what it means to be a social worker in his talk was a field in which women equipped with common sense and sympathy provide a service. So it was a very sort of broad definition of the profession, but his general critique was there was no training and standardization for social workers, that social workers couldn't answer this question: what is the essential knowledge and skill of a social worker? And that because we didn't have those things, that it should not be taken seriously as a legitimate profession. And of course, this was said to a conference of social workers. And so it was a very sort of big moment in the profession. And a lot of what has happened in the last 100 years has been a response to this critique, this idea of let's professionalize social work. We had a variety of different organizations that formed around social work education in the early 1900s, but eventually those all culminate in the formation of CSWE in 1952, which is the association that accredits social work schools. It also importantly establishes what's called the EPOS, or the Education Policy and Accreditation Standards for Social Work Schools. And so all of my professors who you've been hearing from today are very familiar with the EPOS, because those are the competencies that we are required to meet when we teach social work students. And so we develop our entire curriculum along those competencies. In 1955, we have the emergence of the NASW, which serves lots of important functions for social workers as a organizing membership organization, but also is where our code of ethics comes from. And so that's another sort of foundational concept in our profession. And I think when we talk about what does it mean to be a social worker, my guess is most people think of the code of ethics. And so that's a big piece of sort of the conversation. And then finally, in 1979, we have the formation of the ASWB, which is this nonprofit that is primarily tasked with serving regulatory boards. And so they create these exams that are designed to develop and measure minimum competency amongst social workers. And so this is essentially, in terms of larger structures and policy over the last 100 years, what it has meant for us to gatekeep our profession, and for us to define the profession as social workers. And in many ways, a lot of these systems have been formed and developed inspired by adjacent professions. And so social work education is very deeply informed by and influenced by medicine, teaching, law, psychology. A lot of those other existing professions were sort of structures that we kind of adopted in social work education. And that's why you see social work education programs have, sort of didactic content, but also a big emphasis on practice-based learning and internships and practicums. We also see a mirroring in our licensure, that the licensure processes mirror the similar licensing processes in other professions. And so sort of, again, the general history is CSWE starts offering accreditation guidance in around 1952 for master's programs. They don't actually offer guidance for bachelor's level programs until the mid-1970s. Code of ethics comes into the picture around 1960. And then we have in the 1980s, ASWB's initial deployment of a lot of these different licensing exams. And so this is sort of the general history behind the profession and where these structures come from. One thing I do want to point out real quick is there is a divergence between other professions and social work that I think is important for us to understand. So in particular, I think a lot of, people will look at social work and how it mirrors medicine, for example, but there are some important differences where in medicine, the USMLE step 1 and 2 for sort of their board exams for measuring clinical knowledge are actually integrated into med school. You graduate from med school when you pass your board exams. Whereas in social work school, there's this disconnect between our licensing process and our education process, where you can earn an MSW and that doesn't automatically mean that you're in for licensure. There's a separate process that occurs. And I think some of those differences are things for us to think about. Also, as I'll get into in more detail, there are some very fundamental differences between how ASWB has functioned as an organization and how a lot of their comparable organizations function in other fields, in particular medicine and law. And the transparency of those organizations is very different. And that's another sort of area of focus for a lot of us who have been advocating in this space. So what are these exams and what do they measure? Those of you who have taken them are well aware they're just a multiple choice question exam. Where do they come from? Basically, ASWB uses a process called practice analysis, where they do a survey of social workers to identify standards that will then be used to guide the development of exam questions. In other words, it's almost like a mirror. It's looking at the social work profession, surveying social workers. What do you think you need to know in your job? And then using that to develop standards to then create questions that are usually recall, application, and reasoning-based questions developed by experts. The way they test these new exam items that are created from this process is basically by piloting them in every administration of an ASWB exam. And the way they do that is there's usually 170 questions, and 20 of them are pilot questions that are being tested. And so these are unscored questions on the exam that are new, that are then like being considered for inclusion as formal graded questions in future iterations of the exam. Now, I've already mentioned this, but this bears repeating, that one of the big challenges, and this is something that's been at the topic of conversation for a long time, is that we have this disconnect between ASWB's practice analysis standards and CSWE's education policy and accreditation standards, that these two things are not the same. And that is something that is, in fairness, extremely frustrating to new MSW grads, that the things you learned in school are not necessarily directly connected to the things that are going to be asked of you on a test. This is aside from any of the concerns about racism and ageism altogether. This is just the structure of the test on the surface as a sort of structural flaw with the whole process. What does the ASWB exam not measure is an interesting question to me, and I think it doesn't measure a lot of stuff. It doesn't measure social work skills and abilities. This is a sort of a topic for debate, and some people may have different views than I do. I don't think you can detect somebody's ability or skills through a multiple choice question. That is something that is best measured through supervision, through observation, through practice. And somebody can answer a question about empathy correctly and have no skills in providing empathy to their clients. And so these exams can't actually measure what they say they measure on the surface, in my opinion. Again, they don't align with what people learn in social work programs across the country. I would say they do very little to protect the public. Whether I can answer a question about psychodynamic theory on a multiple choice exam bears little relevance to my ethics and skills to provide good practice to my clients. I think it says something about somebody's ability to recall knowledge. There's something there in exams. Mostly it says something about your skill with answering a multiple choice question. And of course, there's the bigger concern, which is for a very long time, dating back to the 1990s, a lack of transparency from ASWB. And that you can go back and read all of the different op-eds and articles published by different social workers who were concerned about this. Multiple studies or ad hoc studies, and this is one of the challenges, is we don't have access to ASWB data until just recently. And even then, we are still lacking access to a lot of the data we would want access to actually be able to do proper analysis. So most studies have been on the outside looking in without access to the direct data. And even those, especially epidemiological studies using state level licensing data, have indicated serious concerns with ASWB since the 90s. It's been 30 years of us knowing there's something off here. There was a particular study that I think is a sort of a groundbreaking one in 2019 that largely influenced a lot of what's happened over the last few years, which was an analysis of sample questions from ASWB. And so we had actual test items to look at and do analysis on. And what the researchers found in these example questions were multiple instances of microaggressions in the questions. There was sort of a pervasive problem in the questions of assuming that the test taker or a protagonist in the scenario was white. There was a unnecessary specification of race for people who were not white in the questions. There were examples of questions based on cultural stereotypes in assessing cultural competency, ironically. And then there's a general concern with an ecological fallacy that basically ASWB does not follow best practices used in other domains for developing questions. They use what's an analysis of individual items, and they determine that they are race neutral and that they are equitable without also including sort of test result analysis. In fact, they would say they did not have access to that data. So if we would ask for it, and there are examples dating back to the 90s of us asking for data of test results based on demographic factors, and they would say, we literally don't collect that data. We don't have it to give it to you. It turns out that was a lie, but we'll get to that in a minute. So in addition to all of this, there's a lot of ad hoc research that demonstrated significant disparities in master's level licensure for Black, Latinx, Asian, and multiracial graduate students. And this is all happening also in the context of a larger conversation in sort of the testing community around the validity of tests in general. And so we have examples of Ivy League institutions like Harvard no longer using SAT and ACT scores as major factors in their admissions, and lots of other examples of organizations and structures realizing that there's a problem with standardized tests in particular and how they disproportionately affect different populations. All of this leads up to basically a groundswell of push from CSWE, NASW, individual social workers around the country, asking ASWB to finally release some data. We're saying we can't wait any longer. We need to see the data. In 2020, ASWB formally refuses these requests. They assure us that they hire diverse exam writers and conduct thorough item level analysis and continue to hold steady to not releasing data. Of course, this is very suspicious. If the data indicates that there's no problem, why won't you show us the data, right? And that's kind of the check and balance that people are really concerned about, all leading to just last year, 2022, some data being released, published in a report. And of course, as suspected, there were significant disparities between racial groups in all categories. And that's what we went off over at sort of the beginning of my talk here. And so this is sort of the general history, why these organizations exist, how we got here, how we're in this present moment of a conversation as a profession about what to do next when it comes to who gets to be a social worker, really is the question we're asking here. And when we ask questions around gatekeeping, often my thought is, who are we gatekeeping? Who are we keeping out? And the answer to that question, according to this data, is BIPOC students, folks with MSWs, where we're keeping out Black students disproportionately, Latinx graduates disproportionately. And these are folks we need in the profession. And I feel like the gatekeeping question is a really important one for us to all struggle with. And obviously I have my opinions. I feel like as individual social workers, it's our task to kind of think about these things and where we stand on this and where our work is moving forward. This is more my opinion here. I'm not speaking necessarily for the University of Oklahoma, but I do feel some serious concerns about ASWB's ability to regulate themselves and our ability to trust them. Before releasing this data in 2022, there are multiple instances of ASWB essentially lying about having it over 10 years, saying we can't give it to you because we don't have it. Turns out they did have it. And that is really concerning to me. Also, as we look at these tests, they've never been validated or shown to correlate to social work competence. And the responses from ASWB are very telling. They're very victim blaming. I was reading a response from an ASWB spokesperson the other day that if I were to summarize it, they basically said, it's not a problem, Black people are bad at tests, is what they said. That's their stance. And to me, as a social worker, that is 100% unacceptable for that to be the official stance of an organization that supposedly is part of a profession that is in its core about social justice and about protecting marginalized and vulnerable groups. There's also some statements deflecting blame towards schools of social work, saying it's not our fault, schools of social work are bad at their jobs. But I would ask you, what is more likely? That all 850, I think, 3 schools of social work across the country are all in unison discriminating against vulnerable populations, or I'm just going to spitballing here, maybe it's this one exam that's kind of the challenge at the center of it. So I feel like a lot of the responses from them have not inspired confidence in their ability to look at this and make improvements. They continue to refuse to share test content and raw data. So one of the big challenges is we can't actually analyze the tests. We can't look at them. We can't actually take a critical eye and say, well, what's the problem here? Because we don't have the data. And then, of course, there's this big problem that's a critique that they're not following best practices for differential test functioning analysis in addition to their differential item functioning analysis. One thing to be really careful of is, as we're having these conversations, to beware of the straw man argument that's out there in full force. There was a New York Times op-ed about, the general thesis was basically, do you really want an unregulated profession? And to me, that's not what we're talking about. A licensure should and probably can continue to exist. The question is, how do these tests fit into that process? We're not talking about not regulating social work. We're talking about the sort of policies within which we do so, and if they are equitable to different populations. Here's a few different formal responses from different organizations that we've already been mentioning. So we have CSWE coming out and formally committing to explore the elimination of licensing exams. Their position is that they feel it's redundant, that if you get a degree from an accredited program, why would we second guess that? NASW came out just a few months ago with a very strong statement against licensing exams after a review of the data. And we also have an agreement here more locally through the School of Social Work, where our faculty are advocating that the ASWB exam be in particular eliminated at the LMSW level. Has been our big focus right now. And this idea of really encouraging Oklahoma to look at our specific policies. If I were to sum it all up, I feel like Matthew DiCarlo's statement really kind of captures things nicely, is that perhaps we are at a point where the assumption that competency is best assessed by locking a social worker in a room with a long multiple choice exam of unknown validity and racial sensitivity has expired in its utility. Perhaps the ASWB's annual profit of $6 million from examination administration and $800,000 from publishing study materials should lead us to question their monopoly on social work licensure. And so this is sort of a real quick, I know I'm running short on time, 25-minute overview of what's been going on, where we are. This is where we are right now, basically, is people making statements, calling for change, and then now it's about, state by state, us deciding what that looks like. We have Kansas, Arkansas, Illinois, California, different states that are already pretty advanced in doing something about this. And so that this is basically the state part of that whole heuristic on my first slide, changing how they define what it means to go through the process of licensure. And in the state of Oklahoma, it's an interesting question. It is codified into our regulations. And so Title 59, the Social Work Licensing Act, does have language that is connected to ASWB exams loosely. I would highlight that ASWB exams are actually not codified by name. What the licensing sort of guidance tells us is that we need to have somebody who has passed an examination under the Social Work Licensing Act. And it's sort of a circular logic in the law. Basically, the act, it sort of defines itself in many ways, the way it's written. The examination is defined as a standardized test or examination of social work knowledge, skills, and abilities, which have been approved by the board. But it also does not define the word standardization. And so this is my belief is, and this is, I'm not a lawyer, so take this with a grain of salt. And so my lawyer friends can tell me whether or not I'm totally off base here, but I really do believe that our social work board actually has some wiggle room with this language, that they get to determine what this test or examination of social work knowledge, skills, and abilities is. And that they don't necessarily have to change the law to change ASWB exams. And I know that that's a conversation that is maybe a little outside of my competence, and that the lawyers would really need to help advise on that. But that's sort of my stance with the board, is that they have the flexibility to think about this in new and creative ways. The word standardization usually is a reference to the administration and scoring of a measure and not the measure itself. And so it doesn't even have to be a multiple choice test, right? Standardization can be written, oral, performance-based. And again, it doesn't say anything about the quality of the instrument, the validity and reliability of it. And so I think that, in my opinion, there are ways that the social work board could address these concerns without the need necessarily to go through a major legislative process. And I also understand that not everybody agrees with that perspective. And so that's a thing for us as Oklahomans to kind of struggle with. So what can we do next in the state of Oklahoma? Tomorrow actually is the Oklahoma Board of Social Work meeting. This will be my third consecutive meeting at the board, advocating with them and kind of having conversations with our colleagues on the board about this issue and what can be done about it. And so it's an open meeting. Anybody can come. It's a good way to kind of speak and learn more about the sort of gatekeeping processes in the state of Oklahoma. Obviously, if I'm wrong and it turns out that the law does need to be changed, then that's a longer process. That's a situation where, working with representatives and state senators will become part of what it means to draft new legislation and actually work it through Oklahoma City to get it enacted. There have been some folks who have brought up the idea of an executive order from the governor's office and have been using their social and political connections to kind of explore those options. And that's technically another pathway that we could go to address this if in fact it does need to be a change in the statute. There's also national efforts to reform ASWB. And so lots of, I got a call to action from a journal that was shared with me just yesterday, where researchers around the country are looking at this and thinking about this. And so there will be more said about it in the coming years that we can draw from. But also I would really encourage that we've had a group of social work students at the University of Oklahoma who have really taken the front row seat in all of this. And as an educator, I find it incredibly encouraging and inspirational about the future of our profession to watch these social work students really take this issue head on and try to tackle it. But also I would encourage everybody to be thinking about NASW and its importance in moments like this, and our membership in our professional organization, but also our activism within that organization, and get not just being a member, but a member who's involved and active and volunteering and sort of attending meetings and doing all those things we can do to really be organized and united as a profession in our state and across the country. My last piece, and this is what I'll do before I kind of end, is kind of talk about the challenge of supporting new graduates who are all very aware of this problem. New graduates have been thinking a lot about it, and they're now faced with the situation of graduating with an MSW and having to go out and take an exam that not only were they worried about it before, but now we got all this other stuff that's in their head as they go in there. And I wonder about the impact on new grads. And so I think that in addition to advocacy, for us to think about what it means for us to support and to mentor new MSWs through these processes. When an MSW, which for the foreseeable future in the state of Oklahoma, they'll still have to take the ASWB exam, what are we doing to support them through that? What we've been doing at OU is we have a series of LMSW prep sessions this entire spring, and we did it in the fall as well for grads that we're offering, free of charge to any graduate who wants to attend in Tulsa online or through Norman. And it's all on Zoom. And in fact, we have our third session tomorrow. Me and Professor Adamson are leading a session reviewing direct practice with individuals, families, and groups, and reviewing some of those concepts for folks who are going to graduate and have to take this exam. Also, Professor Kendrick is kindly volunteered to help with some of the macro stuff and policy stuff later on in review sessions. And I would just encourage us all to think about what it means to walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can be advocates in this space and also think about what it means to support our colleagues who are entering the profession. For those of you who are preparing for this test, once you graduate, you have a year from the date when your provisional license is issued to pass the exam. So there's not a whole lot of pressure right out of the gate, but basically you have those 12 months to pass this exam. This is where the sort of ethical issue of disproportionate impact that is financial on vulnerable and BIPOC populations is very in focus for me. This idea that somebody could spend up to $1,000 taking the test 4 times in their first year is something that I think, I don't know if we need to start a GoFundMe for students or something, but this idea that that's a big financial burden to ask a new graduate to bear. Once a person has their provisional license, even before they pass the exam, they can start accruing clinical hours if they want to become a clinical social worker. And one of the big stressors that I've heard time and time again from folks is that when I don't pass my exam, or if I don't pass my exam, worst case scenario, that year comes up and I don't pass. This is a situation where that person immediately stops supervision. They can request more testing time to keep trying. But basically, most students, or I keep saying students, but social workers in this situation are folks who are going to lose their job. These are clients who are going to lose their therapist. I had a colleague last year I was visiting with who had, a caseload of 40 people who lost their clinician overnight because they couldn't pass the exam. And so this is not just an abstraction. It has real world financial implications for social workers and also real world implications for clients. It's a complicated process. I have Jenna's email up here. She's in Oklahoma City. I know Jim Marks was speaking to you all earlier today about the licensure process more generally. And they are great resources for social workers in the state of Oklahoma. And I almost had a slide where I put this in big, bold letters, but I'm just going to say it right now, especially to our new social work graduates this coming year, is don't be mean to Jenna, is all I'm saying. That's my refrain. These people are public servants. They are resources for you. They aren't the people who created these policies. They are just tasked with overseeing licensure in the state of Oklahoma, and let's respect them for the important work they do for our profession in this state. On the exam itself, I mentioned sort of the structure. There's 170 questions. 20 of them are non-scored pilot questions, but you have no idea what is a scored or unscored question, right? As a test taker, they're all mixed together and at random. So you'll be asking a HIPC question 1 minute and a practice question the next, and so on and so forth. And that's how the structure is. It's a 4 hours computerized test. One of the big things I do like about it is you do find out whether you passed or failed immediately. So you don't have to sit around like with medical board exams and wait for 3 weeks to get your results. So you'll know right away whether or not you've passed it. But you won't know what questions you got right, what questions you got wrong. So when you get that score, it's not terribly useful to you in terms of studying more. Like, where was I struggling? I have no idea. It's kind of a tough thing. And also with this idea that it makes me wonder the sort of individual item analysis, that when you have microaggressions and prejudice built into questions, and let's say even ASWB's process catches those, and their individual item analysis will take a sort of a non-scored pilot question and then exclude it from future tests. It still exposed that test taker to that question, and they had no idea whether it was pilot or not, and it had an impact on them in the moment. And you think about, I was looking at an example of a biased test question earlier, where the concept of machismo in Latinx communities was sort of a stereotype that was embedded in the question. And I imagine what it's like for a Latinx social worker to struggle with that question and the answer to it that is so difficult given the cultural prejudice built into the question. And what if it was a pilot question and it totally threw them off their game for the rest of the exam? And how this structure is something that has a lot of sort of problems. Also, the question I often get from students is, how many do I need to pass to get right to pass the exam? And that's not an easy question to answer either, because they weight the questions. So you may have an easy question on an Erickson stage of development that's worth a fraction of what another question is worth. And so it's another thing where it gets hard to kind of wrap your head around, what does it mean to be successful in this test? In general, between 93 and 160 out of the 150 scored questions are what you need to get right to pass. And then again, that's going to vary from person to person depending on the distribution on the exam. The content of the exam is about a quarter HIPC stuff, a quarter assessment and intervention, a quarter practice with different system levels, and then another quarter on values and ethics and things like that. So, the content of the exam is roughly in these categories, and that's what we usually use to recommend people studying strategies. So for my folks who are already licensed, congratulations. For those of you who are not yet licensed, let me just say to you that the ASWB exam is not a reflection of your knowledge and skills as a social worker. And I say that with confidence, that if you struggle on this exam, I'm very angry about you struggling on it, but it doesn't say anything about your skills. It's just a test. And it's a racist, ageist, and ableist remnant of 100-year shadowboxing max, in my opinion. Study and prepare as best you can, join advocacy efforts. And I think that as a profession that is tasked with eliminating injustice, and we're so focused on social justice as a profession, that it's really hard for me to think about how Oklahoma social workers can, with a straight face, go to different systems in our state and advocate for change when we won't change the problems in our own house. And so for me, this is very much a big part of what it means to be an ethical social worker moving forward. And again, everybody has their own perspective on this and sort of a relationship to it. But just again, as I mentioned, we're advocating. We'll be at the board meeting tomorrow, and then tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. we'll do an LMSW prep session. And me and Professor Adamson will go over a bunch of practice questions, and that's all we can do for now, in my mind, to kind of address this conversation in a way that is productive for graduates and also true to our sort of code of ethics. Well, look at that. I did it in 41 minutes, Charlotte. Are you proud of me?
I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you.
Your question time now.
Yeah. Well, just very briefly, anyone can join the LMSW prep series on the socialworky.com.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was up there on your, you might, if you could, maybe put that in chat where people can, if you don't mind.
Yes. And I'm actually going to put a direct link in the chat. That Social Worky is a website that redirects to it, and some people have a hard time with that for some reason.
Okay.
So in that, there's a direct link.
Okay. And then, so you're getting that, and I'll do a couple of 3-hour prep sessions, one in May and one in the first part of June. I will get those out on our social media sites. You can also email me. I will put my email here in the chat in just a minute. Got a question about, 2 questions about how it affects people with disabilities, their accommodations and so on and so forth. I personally have had, I know that Jim has gone to bat with one of my former students who graduated on getting a test taken. So what do you know about that, John?
I don't know enough to be 100% honest with you. I mean, I have the anecdotal sort of stories and what I've learned through speaking to students who have different learning styles. I know that for a lot of students who are differently abled, that the idea of putting on noise canceling headphones for 4 hours and looking at a computer screen is just really a hard ask for those students, given their sort of abilities. And then also folks with vision impairment, that can always be a challenge when you're asking them to use screen readers to take the test and stuff. So I think there's a lot of concern about the ability, especially of these test taking facilities. These are usually third-party companies that are administering the test, to support the needs of differently abled test takers. And
Right.
So I think the data is we don't have the data we want on that as much as we do around age and race. But we know just from the wealth of stories that you hear from social workers, and sometimes they're just straight up horror stories of the kinds of treatments that they receive day of test, and then how that creates really adverse outcomes for those folks.
Yeah. Some questions about people who already have the LMSW. Are there going to be sessions for the LCSW? Anyone is on mine that I give. Honestly, the questions that I used are come out of a book that was meant for prepping for the LCSW. And so anyone is welcome to attend those. They're free of charge. I think just one thing that I would say, it hasn't always been this way, and somebody put that in the chat. I didn't have to take the LMSW. I went straight into supervision and took the LCSW. So at some point, I researched it. I can't remember exactly when it was. The law changed, right? The other thing that I think is a huge social justice issue, John, you touched on it. people are graduating, they've spent thousands of dollars. In some situations, if you don't work for a government agency, you are required to get that LMSW as a condition of your employment.
Hmm.
So many places, so students are frantic about getting that and getting it passed. And those of us that are on the screen that have an LCSW and haven't had it for a while, we didn't have to do that. We had time, we had no pressure, we got a job, we got supervision, we studied, we had time to go and get that LCSW. So I think that's just a huge, start to say imposition, but honestly, that's not a big enough word. But at any rate, so I'm going to put, a couple of people said that I was the first class who had to take the LMSW, graduated in 2015. So the law changed at some point prior to that. Okay, I'm going to put, John, thank you. I'm not even upset or sorry, and I don't think anybody else is about the change in your title. We couldn't have done justice to preparing for the test in this time. So I think some people on the screen have heard this information, and for others, it was probably a good eye opener. And I saw Mr. Guy Willis shaking his head in agreement on several points. Good to see you, Guy. And I'm going to put in the chat now John's email, my email, and how you get the CEUs, and how you can look at prior recordings. And with that, we're only a minute over. And so I believe next we have at 1 o'clock, we have, I believe it's Molly Bryant with the YWCA. So thank you all for attending. Just keep